My name is Francesco Arduini, and I have the privilege to introduce a book that I edited and that is now available in all stores. It is entitled The God of the Bible. This book brings together the works of various competent authors who carry out a careful analysis of biblical text, a specific biblical text for each chapter. They answer the question, who is the God of the Bible, helping to identify and clearly distinguish the divine figures of the Father and the Son. This is the first in a series of short videos where the authors will have a chance to tell you something about the topic covered in their chapter. The first one to whom I'm going to leave the floor, so to speak, is Montero from Norway, who wrote chapter 6 about John 1:1 and chapter 10 about Colossians 1 from 15 to 20. Before leaving the microphone to Roman Montero, I want to give a special thanks to Land Publisher, who believed in this project from the very beginning, including this book in Land University Press catalog. More videos are coming. Stay tuned.
The two essays I wrote for this volume were on John 1:1 and Colossians 1:15 to 20. I chose these two passages, one, because I felt that they fit my abilities and I found them fascinating, and also because these passages were crucial during the so-called Arian controversy and the Trinitarian disputes of the 4th century. These disputes ended up with what we now know as Trinitarian orthodoxy. And they influenced the theological reading of these texts down to today. The way I organized my essays was I broke them up into two sections. The first section was a purely exegetical and a historical reconstruction of these passages. The second section was a limited theological reading of these texts. In the exegetical section, my main goal was to find out what these passages could have meant to their intended audience and what the author might have been trying to communicate. To that end, I tried to reconstruct the context of these passages, the intellectual context, the cultural context, the historical context, and so on and so forth, as well as the context of these passages within the larger document from which they're taken. Both of these passages function as something like a hymn or a poem. And both of them are largely concerned with issues of theology and Christology, and both display a certain amount of philosophical learning and sophistication. And so that meant that I had to reconstruct the various theological and philosophical currents of that time period. This included examining both Jewish and Hellenistic texts and texts which fit into both categories. For example, that of Philo of Alexandria, who was very much influenced by Middle Platonism, but also grounded in the Hebrew Bible and the Jewish tradition. One thing that I felt that was important in my reconstruction was to not exclude sources based on divisions between Christian, pagan, or Jewish sources. These divisions are often somewhat artificial, and they ignore ways in which the various intellectual currents bled into one another and influenced one another. So I tried to include everything that I felt would help elucidate the historical meaning and historical understanding of these texts. My exegetical method was fairly conventional. I went bit by bit through the passages, trying to understand what the original audience could have understood these passages to be communicating, what concepts they might have been drawing on, and what issues they might have been addressing, and what concepts the author might have been wielding to communicate what he was trying to communicate with regards to theology and Christology, and with regards to whatever issue was being addressed by these passages. In this section, my intention, my goal, was to avoid any theological assumptions or conclusions and to focus purely on a historical reconstruction of these passages. One pitfall that I noticed in working through some of the secondary literature is that again and again, one sees theologically loaded concepts and terms being used, such as monotheism, worship, divine identity, divine embodiment. These concepts and terms, if they're not carefully defined and their usage defended, can end up inadvertently weighing down the reconstruction of these passages with theological assumptions, and can sometimes serve to obscure these passages and end up being vague, so as to be unhelpful with regards to exegesis and historical reconstruction. Just to take one example, that of monotheism. In my essay, going through the sources, I demonstrate how the term theos in both Greco-Roman culture and Jewish culture was underdetermined and could mean different things depending on the context. The idea that the Greco-Roman world was polytheistic and the Jewish world was monotheistic is far too simplistic. The fact is that both cultures had concepts of a most high, transcendent God, as well as lesser gods. And one finds concepts of subordinate, mediating divinities, divine beings, intermediaries in both cultures. So in my essay, I tried to attempt to be clear in my language and nuance how I used my terms in line with the available historical data and in line with the sources. My next section was a theological section. For those who are purely interested in these passages for their historical value and for reconstructing the history of early Christian thought, this theological section might not be so interesting, but for those who view these passages as theological sources, such as being part of Scripture, then this section might be more interesting. I did the theological section in the two essays a little bit different. For the essay on Colossians 1:15-20, I kept my goal relatively modest. I didn't attempt to present a full theological interpretation or a full-blown theological hermeneutic. Rather, I drew on my findings from the historical exegetical section so as to provide theological boundaries for any theological instruction. In other words, I wanted to examine what kind of theological claims and interpretations are compatible with a historical exegesis of Colossians 1:15-20, and which interpretations or claims from a theological standpoint would conflict with a historical exegesis of Colossians 1:15-20, and to argue for these theological boundaries from the text itself, specifically when thinking of the relation of Christ to creation and to Christ to the Creator. In the theological section in the essay on John 1:1, I take a slightly bolder approach. In this section, I look at the Nicene Creed, and specifically the homoousion of the Nicene Creed, and I see if John 1:1, in the prologue of John, could fit with that sort of formulation. Rather than give my own theological analysis, though, I turn to perhaps what I consider to be the greatest theologian who wrote on the prologue of John in the ancient world, namely Origen of Alexandria, specifically to his commentary on John. And I try and lay out Origen's understanding of the theology of John's prologue. And then I look at some points where I differ with Origen in my understanding of the prologue and highlight those areas where I agree with Origen. And then I take the resulted theological reading and compare that with the Nicene Creed, with the homoousion, and with the standard Trinitarian formulations of Augustine and Gregory of Nyssa. And I see if a theological reading of John 1:1 could reasonably support the homoousion, or if it fits better with a heterousion formulation. My hope with these essays is that they will contribute something to the understanding of early Christian thought within the Greco-Roman world and within the Jewish grounding, and that it will contribute something to an understanding of the history of Christianity and the development of Christian self-understanding and Christian theology. When it comes to theology, my hope is that my essays will open the door to a more open-ended theological approach, one not grounded in a dogmatic or creedal approach, but one which is more open-ended and which starts with a clear and consistent hermeneutic, and that starts from the text towards a theological reading rather than starting from a creedal approach and bring that to the text. I hope that also my essays will encourage more people to look at these texts within their world, to understand the complex and interconnected historical and intellectual context of these passages, and to gain a fuller understanding of the world of the prologue of John and of Colossians 1:15-20, and to really appreciate the richness of these passages. For the whole project, I can say that I'm very happy that I was invited to contribute to this project. I'm very happy that I could work along with such other capable researchers to put this volume together. I think this book is a solid contribution to the understanding of the biblical text, and that hopefully it will be a challenge to some of the more traditional readings of the Bible, and that it will hopefully encourage more people to take a fresh look at the biblical text.